In January of 1974, a magazine article celebrating a car that most people had never heard of landed on a desk inside the Environmental Protection Agency in Washington. And within months, the man behind that car had been handed a federal cease-and-desist order threatening him with fines of up to $50,000 for a single vehicle. A staggering sum for a car that had begun life as one of the cheapest, most humble economy models General Motors had ever built. A story that sounds almost like a joke, except every part of it actually happened, verified across multiple accounts from the people who lived through it. And to understand how a magazine feature could summon the full weight of the United States Department of Justice down on one small speed shop on Long Island, you have to go back to a moment when the American muscle car era was already dying. But not everyone had gotten the memo, because by 1970, Detroit's horsepower war had reached a genuine peak. Chevrolet and Chrysler were both claiming over 400 factory horsepower from their big block engines. Buick had unleashed the GS 455 Stage 1. And for a few incredible years, it seemed like the manufacturers themselves couldn't build cars fast enough for a public that couldn't get enough speed. But somewhere in that arms race, one man on Long Island decided the factory offerings still weren't wild enough. And to appreciate how strange his story is, it helps to remember what else was happening to muscle cars at exactly that moment. Because 1970 wasn't just the peak of the horsepower war, it was also the year the ground started shifting underneath the entire genre. The same year President Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency and signed sweeping amendments to the Clean Air Act into law. And even NASCAR was pulling back, banning the towering rear wings that had pushed stock cars dangerously close to 200 miles an hour on superspeedways. So the muscle car was already fighting a war on multiple fronts, against regulators, against insurers, and soon against a global oil crisis nobody saw coming. And his name was Joel Rosen, known to everyone in the business simply as Mr. Motion. And Rosen ran a speed shop called Motion Performance out of Baldwin, New York, in partnership with a local dealership, Baldwin Chevrolet, an arrangement that lent his outrageous creations a level of institutional credibility almost no other speed shop in the country could claim. Letting customers walk in, order a Camaro, Chevelle, Nova, or Corvette straight from the factory, and have it delivered directly to Rosen's shop before it ever touched a showroom floor, where it would emerge weeks later as something else entirely. A Baldwin-Motion Phase 3 supercar, stuffed with high-rise intakes, aluminum heads, chrome side exhaust, magnesium wheels, and in some cases an actual written guarantee in ink that the finished car would run the quarter-mile in under 12 seconds at over 120 miles an hour, or Rosen would refund the customer's money. And remarkably, records suggest no customer ever successfully collected on that guarantee, which tells you everything about how seriously these cars performed, and the shop itself became something of a pilgrimage site for East Coast performance enthusiasts throughout the late 1960s and into the early 1970s, a place where a customer could walk in wanting a reasonably quick Camaro and walk out weeks later with a vehicle capable of humiliating genuine race cars, backed by paperwork from an actual licensed dealership rather than a backyard mechanic's handshake. And between 1967 and 1974, Rosen built somewhere around 500 of these cars, each one financed and warrantied through an actual Chevrolet dealership, giving buyers something almost unheard of in the aftermarket world: factory-level legitimacy wrapped around genuinely terrifying performance. But here's where the story takes its strangest turn, because by the early 1970s, the muscle car era around Rosen was already collapsing. The government had begun tightening emissions rules under a new Clean Air Act. Insurance companies were slapping punishing surcharges on anything with a big block badge or a functional hood scoop. And General Motors itself, along with Ford and Chrysler, was rapidly detuning its lineup to survive the new regulatory reality, and right in the middle of that industry-wide retreat, with Detroit shifting from optimistic gross horsepower figures to the far less flattering real-world net horsepower ratings that would soon make even a brand-new Chevelle SS look like a shadow of its 1970 predecessor on paper alone, Rosen decided to attempt his most audacious build yet. Because Chevrolet had just launched a brand-new economy car called the Vega, a small, lightweight subcompact designed purely to compete with fuel-sipping imports from Japan, never intended to carry anything more than a modest four-cylinder engine. And Rosen looked at that tiny engine bay and saw an opportunity nobody else had seriously attempted. He wanted to fit a full-size Chevrolet big block, the same 454 cubic inch monster found under the hood of a Corvette, into a car that weighed barely 2,000 pounds. And the engineering required to make that fit was genuinely extreme, a feat many professional engineers at the time would have dismissed as impractical or simply not worth the trouble. And Rosen's team had to build a heavy-duty cooling system just to keep the engine from cooking itself inside such a cramped space, shorten the drive shaft to compensate for the Vega's much smaller wheelbase, and drill the stock brake rotors to accept a completely different 5-lug bolt pattern just so the car could run the wider 14-inch wheels needed to put that kind of power to the pavement without destroying itself in the process. And when it was finished, the result was something almost absurd to look at. A lightweight economy hatchback that most people associated with grocery runs and daily commuting, now sitting impossibly low over enormous rear tires, with a scoop punched through its hood to clear a big block intake never meant to fit inside a car that size. A car built to sip gasoline now capable of embarrassing machines several times its size and weight. And for a while, that absurdity was exactly the point. The Baldwin-Motion Super Vega became a cult sensation among performance enthusiasts precisely because nobody expected a car that small to hit that hard. But that same absurdity was also what eventually destroyed it, because in January of 1974, a veteran automotive journalist named Ro McGonigal wrote a feature for CarCraft magazine documenting Rosen's creation under the title King Kong Lives on Long Island, a piece meant simply to celebrate one of the wildest specialty builds of the era. But neither McGonigal nor Rosen anticipated who else would end up reading it, because the article caught the attention of officials at the newly formed Environmental Protection Agency, an agency that had only been established a few years earlier under President Nixon and was actively looking to enforce the emissions standards written into the Clean Air Act amendments. And buried inside that celebratory magazine feature was essentially a detailed confession, because building a big block Vega meant physically removing factory emissions equipment that had never been designed to accommodate an engine that large. Equipment the law now required to remain intact on every vehicle sold for street use. And so, what had been intended as pure enthusiast advertising, a magazine spread meant to drum up business and glorify Rosen's engineering, instead became the evidence that triggered a federal investigation. And by the time the Department of Justice got involved, Rosen wasn't just facing bad publicity, he was facing a cease-and-desist order that treated every single modified emissions component as a separate violation. And the math behind that order was staggering, because the government calculated a potential fine of $10,000 for every emissions device removed during the build process. And a big block Vega conversion typically required stripping out multiple such devices, meaning the total exposure on a single car could reach $50,000, an amount that dwarfed what the car itself was worth many times over, effectively making it financially impossible for Rosen to continue building, marketing, or even publicly advertising these cars for street use ever again. And that's the twist that makes this story so different from every other muscle car casualty of the era. Because Rosen's cars weren't killed by an insurance company deciding they were too risky to cover, And they weren't killed by a corporate decision in a Detroit boardroom deciding the horsepower war wasn't worth fighting anymore. They were killed because the government had effectively made it illegal to advertise a car that couldn't legally exist on public roads in the first place, and faced with fines that could bankrupt his business several times over. Rosen settled with federal prosecutors in 1975, agreeing to a comparatively tiny $500 fine in exchange for a binding promise that Motion Performance would stop building specialty vehicles with non-factory powertrains intended for street use. And this is where most stories like this simply end. But Rosen found a narrow path forward that reveals just how absurd the entire situation had become, because the settlement only restricted vehicles built and marketed for street use. So Motion Performance kept building outrageous machines, refusing to simply vanish the way many smaller specialty shops of that same era eventually did. They just started invoicing every single one of them as being for export or strictly for off-road competition use only, a legal fiction that technically kept Rosen within the letter of his agreement while doing almost nothing to change what these cars actually were. But it fundamentally changed who could buy them, because a car labeled for export or competition